The Old Testament is severely misunderstood by people in today's world. People often think of the law of the Old Testament as being barbaric and senseless, oppressing the people. Among these misconceptions is that slavery during the time of the Old Testament was on par with the slavery of the Antebellum South. This, however, is a misunderstanding. The Bible's ideas on the subject were not like it at all. For context, the slavery of the Antebellum South was an abomination, and it deserves every bit of condemnation that it has received from our modern ears. I myself am an African American who has ancestry in slavery. As an African American and a Christian, antebellum slavery has my stamp of condemnation. Critics of the Bible tend to have a poor understanding of the history of slavery or servitude. The evolution of the practice does not concern them much. They would rather use it as a buzzword. This is a purely emotional response that does not wish to consider the data. The God of the Bible does not condone anything that resembles antebellum slavery. As a matter of fact, this God opposes this form of servitude entirely. It is an affront to the sacred laws that he has passed down to his people. How could this be, you may ask? How could laws for slavery possibly be sacred? First, it must be understood that slavery is not a good institution. The subjugation that many people faced was an affront against human rights. Through slavery, many lives were seen as trivial, only being seen as the property of the slave owner. Second, it must be understood that the Bible's aim is to completely redefine the institution into something different. As the Bible frames it, this was done because humanity did not want to listen to even the simplest of commands, even before there was an Israel. For example, the Bible starts out with God saying not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. We disobeyed and we ate its fruits. Later, humanity is given a command to spread across the earth and multiply, but we disobeyed, instead gathering up into a single place to create an empire state, Babel, also known as Eridu in the ancient world. The pattern of humanity's disobedience to God and his commands continue throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. The laws given to Moses by God aim to transform the numerous troublesome ways of the Israelites and to minimize the potential of evil. It aims to move Israelite thinking and society towards a certain direction. This can be observed when comparing it to ancient law codes of the day. An important aspect that is often neglected is that the laws that Yahweh had given were reactionary laws. Laws that would reverse the horrible ones that had developed prior to the Exodus event in the ancient Near East. Codes older than the Old Testament were enacted by local providences back then, and they had their own slave codes. Horrifying codes which would completely disregard the human rights of any slave. As you can see from the examples pulled from the Code of Hammurabi, the Code of Nessalem, and the Code of Ur-Nammu, there were some brutal laws concerning slaves at the time. In fact, the slavery codes here most closely resemble what people think of when they think of antebellum slavery, and these are just a few samples from these codes. You see, the Bible takes the subject of slavery extremely seriously. From the Torah to the prophets, and even to the writings of Paul in the New Testament, the subject of slaves and their treatment was one of the centerpieces of the biblical worldview. In order to make this point, I need to show the progression of the story of slavery in the Old Testament, starting with the book of Genesis. This is about the time before God had set the law into motion. Due to rebellion at the Tower of Babel, which was about the attempt to create a super empire that would oppress others, the nations were scattered at Babel. The true God temporarily dissociated himself from the human population at large, and decided that he would create a nation from a person of his own choosing. This is when he called Abraham of Ur of the Chaldeans. Genesis depicts this as a chaotic time in which Abraham and his descendants travel across the ancient Near East, between the ancient cities around that time. Abraham, called Abram at the time, had come from Ur under the law of Ur-Nammu. The slave laws of Ur-Nammu are the context of Abraham and Sarah's treatment of Hagar, as well as God's response to it. The law of Ur-Nammu is the oldest surviving law code that we have discovered to this day. As a matter of fact, the story of Sarah and Hagar is a testament to how ancient the oral tradition of Abraham's story is. The conflict between Hagar and Sarah is partially a commentary on the code of Ur-Nammu's slave laws. Sarah had coaxed Abraham into sleeping with Hagar in order to bear a child through her, as she was unable to have a child of her own at the time. This was against God's plan and brought strife, as this fuels the jealousy between Sarah and Hagar, in which the latter shows contempt for her mistress, leading to Sarah abusing her. The code of Ur-Nammu gives a punishment for this sort of thing, which is likely what Sarah ended up doing. Line 25. If a man-slave woman comparing herself to her mistress speaks insolently to her, her mouth shall be scoured with 1 quart of salt. Keep in mind that this is before God himself declares any laws directly to the people. He is observing human affairs and interfering in them. Though he has not laid down a law, he still shows a care and concern for slaves. God, as the angel of the Lord, ends up rescuing Hagar from death. The first time he rescues her, he finds her by a water spring and instructs her to go back to Sarah. This is because Hagar is pregnant. She conceives Ishmael in Genesis 16 verse 4 and gives birth to him in Genesis 16 verse 15. Hagar would not have survived being pregnant in the desert, especially if her mouth was scoured with salt. The second time this happens, however, God gives the okay, and he personally supplies water and stays with them. He is there throughout Hagar and Ishmael's life as they live in the desert and protects them from dying. Genesis later goes on to have the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, but God uses this period of bondage to exalt him. From here, Yahweh, the God of the Bible, binds himself and his identity to slavery. The story of the Exodus itself is so famous that it barely needs introduction. The short of it is that the Egyptians have kept the Hebrews in bitter slavery for over 400 years, slavery in which they were forced to build store cities like Pithom and Ramses. This too resembles the slavery of Antebellum Slavery, where my people were brutally enslaved into harsh labor and forced to work without money, dignity, or rest. However, with the amazing tale of the freedom of the Israelites from the hands of the Egyptians, laws regarding servitude went through a radical reform that was not seen throughout the ancient world. At this point in the Old Testament, the story is about Yahweh teaching the Israelites about a new way of life. Sadly, although he saved these people through great feats, Yahweh must deal with a stubborn people who do not wish to listen to him. The people of Israel desired to be like their neighboring nations, to adopt their laws, their ways of life, and their gods. This tragic desire is at the center of the Old Testament drama. The implication is that God had wanted to progressively lift them out of the ways of the people around them, but they refused and conformed to those ways. Throughout the Old Testament, Yahweh is attempting to lead the people into a new way of life. He says this to them, and I quote, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 through 6. If the Israelites obeyed these laws, then their society would have continued to progress. Again, slaves were central to the laws Yahweh had given. First, it must be discussed that the word that is often translated as slave is the Hebrew word ebed. The word ebed is not a word that translates as slave as we understand it. Though it can mean such, the word derives its meaning from the Hebrew word abad, which means to work. The word ebed is used for the workers, the servants of the kings, and the prophets of God. As a matter of fact, the name Hebrew, or Ibri, derives from ebed. That is to say, they were an entire race taken out of slavery. This is strongly tied to New Testament theology, but this will be spoken about in another video. Because of the slavery that Israel had endured under the Egyptians, and because of the laws of the surrounding Near Eastern cultures, revolutionary laws were put into place to protect the human rights of slaves. Now, the first thing that must be discussed is that the law strictly forbids the practice of capturing and selling humans. In fact, doing so will result in the death penalty. In Exodus 21, it reads, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." This made it so that, unlike the surrounding lands, especially those of the Hittites, they were not allowed to kidnap people to sell into slavery. If the Bible had really supported this form of slavery, as many like to report, then it would not put the death penalty on people who capture and sell others. However, what the Hebrews were allowed to do was to buy a slave from a foreign nation. Leviticus does specify that one is allowed to buy a slave from a foreign nation. Though they could not capture anyone, they could take slaves who were already captured and brought into their midst. There was also voluntary slavery, in which one who could not take care of himself would sell himself to serve someone else. Typically, being this kind of slave amounted to doing housework and field work. It was more akin to being a butler or an indentured servant. Slaves were meant to be paid in Israel. Exodus 21 states, "When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing." Exodus chapter 21, verse 2. Deuteronomy elaborates on this further and states, "If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally, out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this day." The Hebrew law would also allow people who were not Israelites by birth to be integrated into the law. This is laid out in the Passover laws. Exodus reads, "If a stranger shall sojourn with you, and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it." From this point on, the wisdom of God shows itself by comparing it to some contemporary laws of the day. Two prominent Near Eastern codes in the days of Moses were the Code of Hammurabi and the Code of Nessalem. The Code of Hammurabi is a Babylonian code that was laid down by the Babylonian king, Hammurabi. Hammurabi dedicated a famous stele in the shape of a finger that has the laws written out. Hammurabi credits his god Marduk, also known as Bel, for his victory over the people of the ancient Near East. In his code, Hammurabi enacted many laws, some of which pertain to slavery. The slave laws given in this code would be a lot closer to what we know from antebellum slavery. The same would go for other law codes such as the Code of Nessalem. You see, before the Old Testament law, human rights were not universally accepted in law codes. Whether slave or free, there were glaring human rights issues in these codes of law. Naturally, the slaves suffered the most out of anyone. The Code of Hammurabi lists that if anyone takes a slave or takes them outside the city gates, they must be put to death. If a slave runs away, he must be returned to his master under the penalty of death. The Code of Nessalem goes as far as to offer rewards based on how far away from the capital that you found the slave before you returned him. Even the Code of Ur-Nammu is guilty of this and offers a monetary reward for returning slaves. The parallels between this and antebellum slavery are phenomenal, horrifying in fact. But what does the God of the Bible say? Surely he must be in agreement with the rest of the ancient Near Eastern world on this, right? No! The God of the Bible did not tolerate this sort of behavior. What Yahweh proclaimed to Moses and the Hebrews was, "You shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose in one of your towns, where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him." Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 15 through 16. It was this God who had given this law, not Marduk, not Ishtar, nor any other. This law did not allow slaves to be returned to their slave master, with explicit commands not to mistreat the slaves as an added bonus. Next up are laws concerning the treatment and handling of slaves. Laws where slaves are injured or killed do not require any trial or severe punishment. Instead, the slave is treated like an object. The broken bones, knocked teeth, and destroyed eyes are more so an issue of lost value, so it focuses more on the slave owner. The Code of Hammurabi and the Code of Antebellum both decree that the owner be paid for his damaged property. These laws do not even concern themselves with the cases of the slave master harming his own slaves. This is where the laws of Moses come in, which states, "When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of the tooth." Exodus chapter 21, verses 26 through 27. With this law, slaves were freed in case of physical abuse. The law is entirely about what is done to the slave and not favoring the owner. This is a quantum leap over what had occurred for over 1,000 years in Ur, and who knows whatever else before. Only the God of the Bible had brought these rights, and only the God of the Bible gives a way out. To go beyond the Code of Hammurabi, the Bible enacts the death penalty for killing slaves from abuse. However, this comes with the stipulation that the slave had to have died the same day as the abuse. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 21. Being called property in Old Testament law denoted ownership, but not the devaluation of human life. Though the idea of punishments are harsh to think of as modern people, the idea was that people were not willing to move past a certain point. Again, these people were not listening to the God of the Bible on laws that would clearly help them. But did God allow slaves to be beaten senselessly without justice as long as they died a few days later? Not at all. When looking at Exodus chapter 21, we receive additional context to help clear things up. This chapter deals primarily with human rights issues, such as slavery, manslaughter, and assault. A few verses prior to the last passage we read, there is a law concerning manslaughter. Exodus chapter 21, verses 12 and 13 reads, "Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate." This concerns if someone was in a fight and accidentally killed someone. Fleeing is meant to allow someone to escape the family members of the deceased who would be seeking vengeance, so that the person could have a fair trial. The reason Exodus 21 verse 20 through 21 does not tell the guilty party to flee is that it is unlikely that a slave would have anyone who would avenge him. However, in both cases, accidental manslaughter does not prescribe the death penalty. Still, the idea that slaves were now valued as people rather than property and were essentially a protected class in Israelite society was a major milestone. This brings us to punishments. Ancient Near Eastern law had standardized punishments for disobedience. Often these laws would require the mutilation of the slave to be performed. The Code of Hammurabi requires that one's ear be cut off for speaking against their slave master. The Code of Antebellum has the punishment of cutting off the ears and nose of a slave for setting a house on fire. An even more arbitrary law would be giving him the death penalty for killing a snake. For killing a snake of all things. Nowhere in the Bible does it sentence anyone to death for such arbitrary acts. As a matter of fact, the Bible is the only code of law in the ancient Near East that prescribes no punishment for slaves. The Bible does not tell masters how to punish slaves, only that they must be careful in going too far or they will receive the death sentence. Imagine what would happen if these people had actually listened to their God, rather than stubbornly act out against him. Their society may have flourished, with even more freedom and rights granted onto these people through social reform. This God, however, was the only God to give a clause for freeing slaves. If one was a Hebrew, they were to be freed after 7 years. However, keep in mind there are laws on joining the Hebrew family through circumcision and the worship of God. Anyone who would make the leap to participate in the Hebrew family would have this in effect. Being a Hebrew was not a racial identity, but an ethnic one. As long as you circumcised yourself, tying yourself into the messianic bloodline, and you worshiped the God of Israel, then you were included in the family. Again, the Hebrew slaves would be freed in 7 years. The Bible was and still is a revolutionary book where people have not lived up to its full potential. The ancient Israelites lost the opportunity with the Old Covenant to form an age better than the one we got due to their own rebellion. Let us not lose sight of what the rebellion of the Old Testament has done to our past, and strive to walk with God towards a better future. Jesus the Messiah fulfilled the covenant and allowed us to change in ways our ancestors could not. Let us follow him and continue to progress until his kingdom comes, rather than falling back into the sins of the old world.